Okay, so I thought that this video was going to be me taking you on a pretty straightforward journey through the moral panics of history and today. But then, over the course of researching this script, I began investigating what makes moral panics explode into our consciousness and take hold of our culture. I started noticing the patterns and connections. I read books written to stoke the flames. I dove deep into the experiences of those that moral panics focus on. And I also spoke to people who were persuaded by their exaggerated fears. I sent out a survey on my Patreon and then extended it into the wider public around people's experiences of moral panics that ended up with over 100 responses within one day. So I'm going to be including a bunch of quotes from people's experiences throughout this video. But all of that led me to keep coming back to one conclusion. It's not just that we haven't truly reckoned with the past moral panics that shape our current reality. It's that we're not ready for what's coming next. Except that, I think we have to be. And God, am I more aware than ever after working on this video of the dangers of coming at a topic from a place of fear, panic even. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that journey together through the deep dive into the world of moral panics, looking at examples from history and today. And we'll explore why the future has me so worried. But we'll also explore who's benefiting from these panics from the shadows, how people just like you and I can fall for them more easily than you think, and how, just maybe, we might be able to make a plan to fight back. How to create a moral panic. So, to put it simply, a moral panic is a widespread sense of fear that a specific group or trend is a threat to social safety and order. The group in question is known as a folk devil and is often targeted by exaggerated and scaremongering reporting. You'll absolutely be familiar with some of the examples, whether from history or your own lives. I don't know how much you can actually see of my background, but I realise I have quite a lot of moral panic paraphernalia in my house, so let me take you through some of them. Okay, so I have some Dungeons and Dragons books and many other things besides, which links to the Satanic Panic, which we'll actually talk about later in the video. I also have, deliberately because of this, a lot of lavender all over my house, which relates to the lavender scare. I also obviously have a lot of books on queer history. So this book, for example, that I just got out of the library, which is around queerness in the 80s, which covers the AIDS crisis and the moral panic around that as well. There's also stuff back there around like the witchcraft panics and the trans moral panic, which is going to be a big focus of the video today. There's also things like the stranger danger moral panic and a whole host of moral panics about like the bad youth violence, which are, depending on the area you're in, blamed on video games or various genres of music. Okay, so if you and I were aiming to create a moral panic, how might we go about it? Not that we would, obviously, and not that anyone does in real life, hypothetically, but if we did want to. Well, okay, let's take the namesake of a truly iconic YouTube video and say we live in Shapeland. Shapeland is full of lots of different shapes. Now we're rectangles, but there's also squares and triangles and hexagons and pentagons and, circles. We, for some reason, have decided to bring the world of moral panics to Shapeland. So let's use Cohen's Stages of Moral Panic as our game plan. He's the guy who kind of coined the term moral panic and folk devils and investigated it in the 70s in regards to the mods and rockers of a couple of decades previously. So, number one, we want to identify a folk devil. This group that's going to be a threat to social order and safety in some way. And that's easy, obviously it's circles. I've always been a bit suspicious of those circles, slippery customers. They don't understand the cultural importance of angles. They want to persuade us that our edges are unnatural. Okay, so then step two. At the moment, it's just a small group of us that are worried about what the circles are up to, but we can do better than that. So we move on to this stage where we get the media involved. So as the next stage of our moral panic, the media reports on this circular folk devil depicting this inciting group or event in very simplified, exaggerated, and emotive ways. Okay, so we're going to do a headline. Circle Elite's secret plan to shave corners off of your children. Maybe we find like a rogue example of a one-off circular crime and we over-report on it. And the reporting has to use emotive and fear-mongering language, non-circular life is under attack. There are monstrous circles who are, hiding in plain sight. They could be anywhere. They're coming for you. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. We have a live moral panic actor in. My black cat has decided to come. Give me a second. I'll remove her. I can hear in the comments, no, don't remove her. She's going to be a nuisance. She's going to knock stuff over. Give me one. I'm so sorry. Give me one. That's the cat tax that you have. I don't know if you can even see her in that background. Okay, so this leads to stage 3. So the story is now out there and it's been legitimized by the media. And so the public reacts to these reports with a growing concern. You know, the Equilateral Express sees the page views on their piece skyrocket and they send their reporters out onto the street for interviews with the general Shape public for a follow-up opinion piece. And then the Rhombus News TV network brings up, you know, Shape experts on a live debate without a circle representative present, obviously. And there are viral cries on X, which also exists in Shape land, because X is also a shape, I guess, for circles to be kept away from mini-shaped children until this is investigated thoroughly. And so then we reach the 4th stage, because at this stage, everyone is talking about this. Everyone's scared, they're worried, they're anxious, they're angry. And so the voices of authority have to respond. And that ends up leading credence to the panic, from parallelogram politicians and police to octagonal opinion makers. Okay, so it's an election cycle in Shapeland, and this is becoming a hot button issue. Politicians don't really know anything about circles. Most of them don't believe in this supposed threat, but it makes for a great manifesto promise, as the general public, having been bombarded with news of this threat, demand action in response. You know, the circle threat is something that I take with the utmost seriousness. There's a slew of book deals announced for shapes that claim the true extent of the circle agenda has yet to be seen. Protests by frustrated circles are met with violent force and reported as evidence of the circle's worrying nature. Until finally we get to the 5th stage, and the panic leads to changes in laws, intensifying of social stigma, or a fizzling out of the moral panic as the folk devils are ostracized into invisibility. You know, a law comes into place that bans circles from influential jobs or volunteer positions around mini-shaped children. There's a rise in circles getting surgery to artificially give themselves angles. The accusations of mini-shape angle shaving are eventually proven false, but it's too late to really make that much of a difference. Now, Cohen's 5 steps are very, very useful for having this kind of breakdown, but I don't think they necessarily get across the intensity moral panics often have. And so for the details of our Shapeland moral panic plan, let's look at Good and Ben Yehuda's criteria of moral panics: concern, hostility, consensus, and disproportionality. So we can't just point out that circles are different. We need to define a key concern about their behavior. That concern is going to be most impactful if it threatens a group or idea that is seen as key to traditional Shapeland. I went with a threat to children as like the future of Shapeland, but I could just as easily have painted them as a threat to law and order, or religious or cultural beliefs, or majority identity. We also can't have this be something that's pointed out calmly and quietly. We need to stir up hostility, maybe out and out violence. These circles aren't just different, they are our enemy. True decent shapes would want to help stop them at all costs. We also can't have it be a fringe effort. Even if the true believers are small in number, we need to utilize Shapeland press, communication networks, social media to create a sense of consensus in the public discourse. We need to make sure that this isn't a measured response to a real threat. Instead, the caricatures of the circles must be exaggerated and the demands against them disproportionate to the reality of their actions. And with that, we have successfully created a moral panic. So while doing my research for this video, I kind of noticed these 3 key overarching strategies for constructing like the moral panic narrative that you would want to put out into the world if you were, you know, hypothetically trying to create one. So the first is disinformation. So this is like out and out just false information that is shared deliberately within a moral panic. These are literally, they're wrong. Right? They're fabricated. But they're very efficient ways of building fear, anger, or confusion, which are the 3 kind of key emotions within a moral panic. So, for example, in Shapeland, the idea that circles are indoctrinating mini shapes into their circle cult and forcing them to mutilate their corners in shaving rituals. The second is misinformation. So this is more information or studies or stories that aren't necessarily made up from scratch, but they're kind of misleading or incomplete in some way. So sometimes this is deliberately spread, but other times it's sort of unwittingly shared too, although the effect is ultimately kind of the same, right? Especially when headline-grabbing misinformation is much more shareable than corrections and fact-checking. So for example, in Shapeland, you could put out a compilation of headlines around circle-related crimes from across like multiple years and cities, and then share it with the claim that, oh, this is evidence of a crime spree of just this week in my city, because you shave off any mention of the dates and locations. And then finally, there's simplification. So this might involve true stories or statements, but a lack of important context means that you haven't really revealed a full picture. This is especially useful against marginalized communities where adding nuance to counter the simplification might end up like educating people around elements of beliefs or cultures or experiences, which is like a very time-consuming extra step in the process and makes it quite inefficient to counter that information because people need like this extra context they don't necessarily already have. So in Shapeland, there might be a claim that circles don't go through the traditional playroom shape holes, which is suggested to be evidence of them, disrespecting shape tradition. But then that leaves out the context that there are no shape holes that circles can safely fit through. So that's kind of the reason, like it's a structural problem. But once these things have been explained and these claims proven false, then the moral panic should stop, right? Like that's how they end. After all, the truth will out. Isn't that what they say? Well, that brings us to the panic element of a moral panic. Crucially, they are soaked through from head to toe in deeply felt and inescapable emotional triggers, ruthlessly pushing fear, anger, and confusion onto the onlooking public. When these emotions are engaged in such a laser-focused way, logic struggles to enter the conversation. Yet the language of logic is kind of co-opted by many at the head of these moral panics. The fact that they themselves aren't part of the disproportionately attacked group means that they're able to weaponize a kind of civilized disposition. They claim that their calm demeanor is proof that they're reasonable, that they're just a concerned citizen. Emotionality can then be activated strategically to give moments of like performative fear or frustration by these people, which only serves to prove how far this terrible situation has pushed them. This normally calm person has been driven to this moment of, outburst. That's how bad this threat is. And if you think that sounds wildly calculated for a panic, boy, do I have news for you. Because panic implies something immediate, instinctual, out of control, but moral panics can absolutely be tightly organized and strategized. Indeed, as Gilbert Hurd explains in the book Moral Panic, Sex Panic, panics can be culturally staged. Elements of the process, once that first domino is pushed, are pretty predictable based on the nature of the different parts of the cycle of a moral panic. So when it comes to the press and mass media, we know that journalists can be pushed to write panic-inducing headlines to sell more papers. And in many modern newsrooms where the typical news stories don't generate enough content, journalists will pitch stories based on things that they've seen other people talk about, whether other outlets or opinion pieces or on social media. And so if you're able to put the conversation in front of them enough, they're going to take the bait. I imagine as we went through that creation of a moral panic, many of you would have made connections to real moral panics that you've seen play out yourself. But within this fictional framework, I think it becomes a bit easier to see how all of the pieces work and to realize the types of groups that might make easy folk devils. Those who oppose the establishment or existing power structures are clear choices. This used to be like youth subcultures protesting or stepping outside the norm, but across my lifetime, the target consistently seems to be marginalized groups who don't fall into a certain set of beliefs, behaviors, agreeability, or conformity. I can think of a host of examples that target people of a particular race or ethnicity, class, sexuality, nationality, gender, or religion. Think of the classic Salem witch trials targeting women, often those who are part of other marginalized groups. There's the post 9/11 Islamophobic moral panic, suggesting that Muslims are inherently violent and dangerous. There's the migrant crisis moral panic, claiming that hordes of foreigners are coming to take our jobs and scrounge off our benefits and enact violence in our streets. These panics can draw on known stereotypes and then reinforce them, exacerbating the perceived differences and divisions between groups of people. Marginalized groups are also often demographic minorities, meaning that they lack the numbers to push back and aren't a large enough population to be a threat to politicians campaigning for votes. They might also lack representation in the spaces that the panics emerge in, so the mainstream media, the police, or the political elite. The bitter irony being that these moral panics are also a method of marginalization in and of themselves. Throughout history, we've seen them lead to deeply rooted suffering, legal inequalities, and even violence. Looking at these examples, a pattern soon emerged for me. Moral panics often seem to come after a moment of these marginalized groups engaging in a kind of boundary crossing in terms of demands for equality, visibility, or aid. These active pushes for equality is seen as a threat to the status quo, and that perceived threat to existential ideas, which is then stoked into a supposed threat to the safety of the general public, is what makes a moral panic. So I think it's time that we put aside the shapeland of it all and apply what we've learned so far to a real life example. Because Shapeland is Animal Kingdom. No, it's modern Britain. I think it's time we talk about the trans moral panic. In this next section, I want to take you through exactly how this panic happened and expose the web of individuals and groups who have been benefiting from stoking these flames of transphobia for personal and political gain ever since. Now, the first wave of trans panic articles in the UK appeared back in 2017, but if you want to know how this trans-obsessed moral panic started, then we need to go back further than that. Because the trans moral panic of today didn't come from nowhere, and it's not a new strategy with novel talking points conjured from thin air. Because the perfect blueprint had already been laid out only a few decades before. Homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Okay, so just over 2 decades ago, I was in a PSHE lesson, which is a physical health sexual health education lesson. I was 12 years old and there was a guest speaker who'd come in. And they were doing this exercise where they basically said, people who agree, go on one side of the room. If you disagree, go on the other. I think she should be suing Jubilee because they took her bit. But for the most part, the things that they were asking about weren't necessarily super contentious. And it was things that didn't necessarily have like a specific answer that you would expect. It was more about experiences and people's thoughts, but about issues that were more contentious. But then they asked, if a friend of yours came out as gay, would you still be friends with them? And I obviously went to the side of the room of, yes, I would. And no one else did. And from that day forth, little Rowan Ellis was pretty relentlessly bullied for being a lesbian at a time when she didn't actually know she was a lesbian. So joke's on her, I guess. Well done to those bullies for clocking me real early. What I knew at the time was that my older brother was gay and that I was sure that being gay was fine. And I would talk about it at the time as if like, I don't think there's anything wrong with being a lesbian. So being bullied for that doesn't affect me on like an emotional level. But I know that there will be other people around who will hear this being said who maybe don't have that kind of confidence in the okayness of queerness, who might be gay themselves, and that is going to have a profound effect on them. I've talked about this in other videos. There was a bunch of other stuff I did. There's a lot of activism within my school, but essentially, one of the things that was most profound for me and my experience was not actually this moment where I walked to the wrong side of the classroom, or the moments afterwards where this was something that was thrown out to me as an insult, but it was at the end of that lesson that the teacher, who at the time had said absolutely nothing as people were sort of giggling behind their hands, approached me at the very end of the lesson when everyone else had already left and sort of whispered to me like it was a secret, which I guess it kind of was. Well done, Rowan, I agree with you. You picked the right choice. I think there was something quite profound in that moment of this sort of real realization that the homophobia that I was seeing from peers, that was this kind of bullying that was often talked about by adults as something that you don't do. Bullying is bad. Here are all of these assemblies about why bullying more generally, although homophobia was never specifically mentioned, are bad. And this implication that this was a thing that teenagers did, that afterwards in the adult world, things changed. And it was this moment of realization of like, oh no, the adults are also powerless in many ways. It had a huge effect, but it wasn't until years later that I understood why that interaction had happened the way it did in that classroom. Because at the time, even though I didn't know it, my experience wasn't isolated to just me or my school. It was part of a wider history, a moral panic that has started in the 1980s. This incident and the many others I experienced in my school days were a direct result of something called Section 28. So there was a picture book called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin about a young girl who lived with her father and his partner. Back in 1986, it was falsely but widely claimed in the press that the book was being distributed to children. This was part of a spark that fed a campaign that led to the introduction of the infamous Section 28 2 years later. This was a government act that stated that a local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, or promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Like, these words, the implications behind them, promoted, pretended, were in government legislation. Section 28 was fully repealed in 2003 when I was 11, so only a year before the PSHE lesson. And I have no doubt that a lot of people who are watching this video were either impacted by this legislation directly when you were at school as a student or in your work as an educator, whether it was during the time that Section 28 was technically in law or afterwards. Here are some examples of how media at the time reacted to the idea of LGBTQ plus topics being taught in schools. The phrasing of our schools as opposed to, the us versus them, their schools. Gay sex lessons, parents' fury. Even though Section 28 wasn't specifically about sex education, it was about kind of any positive mention of queerness whatsoever. This quote is indicative of the attitude of many at the time. The Section 28 could somehow erase LGBTQ plus people altogether, that this would be a positive action because queerness was a kind of social contagion that we should be scared of. I do not agree with homosexuality. I think that Clause 28 will help outlaw it and the rest will be done by AIDS, with a substantial number of homosexuals dying of AIDS. I think that's probably the best way. And the effects of this legislation were very wide-reaching. The National Union of Teachers has said of the effect of Section 28 is to inhibit anti-discrimination initiatives and make it difficult for schools to prevent or address the serious problems that arise from homophobic bullying. Many teachers and librarians felt that they couldn't talk about LGBT issues at all for fear of promoting it in some way and losing their jobs, including reassuring, young LGBT people that they're okay, that there's nothing wrong with them. It also meant that for the most part in formal teacher training, there was no way to deal with LGBT issues. Teachers weren't being taught how to talk about these topics openly, how to handle them if they were brought up by students. And it ended up with this oppressive weight on the shoulders of a generation of LGBTQ plus people, including myself. And the legacy is clear even today. Teaching about LGBTQ plus people, including LGBTQ plus books in school libraries, these are still being debated. Just look at these headlines from the last few years. There's this hopeful myth that all progress is a forward trajectory. And that is true sometimes, but it also isn't inevitable. The prejudices of the past can loop back again, and moral panics are a huge part of that. Take these articles at the height of the AIDS crisis. Gay plague, doomed. Many might assume that we're past that now, but the stigma still remains. We can see it in the backlash that we saw to PrEP and HIV prevention medication in 2016. When faced with increasing cuts, the NHS decided that it wouldn't fund PrEP. And the decision was contested in the High Court by the National AIDS Trust. And these are the kind of headlines that we saw, reactively demonizing PrEP and those who use it as a waste of, public resources, clearly ignoring the fact that studies have found that it's cheaper to prevent HIV to the National Health Service than to treat it. On the front page of the Daily Mail, it was referred to as a promiscuity pill and that funding would be a skewed sense of values, essentially switching the blame on NHS cuts from the government implementing them to a group that has a long history of shame sexualization in the press. Another article claimed that funding would prevent toddlers with cystic fibrosis and deaf children from getting the care that they need. We see here a kind of appeal to puritanical values, homophobia disguised as concern, and an invoking of the suffering of innocent children. This is all too familiar, right, with everything we've covered so far in the video. The visceral and emotional response that moral panics provoke in people means that it embeds harmful stereotypes into the minds of the public that can then be reactivated when it suits. The idea of gay men being innately sexual, perverse, and deserving of some kind of cosmic punishment for this supposed fact is clear in the attitudes of the 80s, but then continues to bubble under the surface so it easily can re-emerge in later decades when it's conveniently activated for a new moral panic. The impact of history is inevitable, whether we acknowledge it or not. Queer history has an impact on queer present, regardless of whether or not it's on a curriculum or permitted to be in a library or a school. And the modern trans panic is a continuation of countless queer moral panics over the centuries. I just want to take a moment here to thank today's sponsor, because writing, as we'll see throughout the video, has the powerful potential to drive social change, for good or bad. And I love the idea of the tools that I use to do that being built by people who understand the value of human thought. It was very refreshing to get an email from Ellipsis, the writing software that is specifically anti-AI and pro-human creativity. They've been super transparent about the fact that they will never integrate or use generative AI in their program. Created by and for writers, you can write, edit, collaborate, and share work in one place without being prompted to let a bot generate your next sentence or agree to have your writing used to train more AI, especially when you don't have to compromise on features because they have everything you'd expect from this kind of writing tool. Real-time collaborative writing, version histories, color theme customization, cross-device syncing, and then they also have some really great unique features like document templates that actually make sense for writers. So there's a great creative goals template that I used earlier in the year year to start to figure out a plan for some upcoming projects, plus a new reader feature where you can link to your work without giving over editing control if you're looking for feedback or just want to share a document safely. And they take feedback and ideas from users over on their Discord, so if there's anything that you want to see, they'll try and make it happen for you. If Ellipsis and their aim to give more ethical alternatives to big tech tools is something that you'd like to get behind and you'd like to support my channel in the process, then check it out at ellipsis.app/Rowan. The link is in the description. Okay, back to the video. Trans people first emerged in the mainstream media at the start of the 20th century, more as objects of fascination and curiosity. But increasingly, with trans people more in the public consciousness, particularly wanting legal or social equality, we see the backlash start. The current climate of transphobia within the UK can pretty easily be traced back to a very specific domino in a long line: a proposal to update the Gender Recognition Act of 2004. I know, it's not really a cool, hot, sexy start, this cardboard, dry-ass sounding piece of legislation. I guess let's try and jazz it up, because this context is important. I just remember the new lights in the background change colours, so let's do another colour on the trans flag for this. Okay, here we go. Let me get into character. Welcome to HGTV, hot gender television, introducing the 2004 Gender Recognition Act. This act enabled trans adults to obtain gender recognition certificates, allowing them to change the gender on their birth and death certificates and a few other administrative documents,
as long as they identified as either male or female and were not in a pre-transition marriage.
This act is new and improved, meaning that it beats its competitors from other countries because it doesn't require sterilisation to have your gender recognised by law. Oh, I'm hearing we have a caller on the line. Hello caller. Are you excited to purchase this incredible new act? Hey, long-time viewer, first-time subscriber. Doesn't that exclude trans people under 18 and also non-binary people and also people who were married to their current partners before they transition? Sorry, let me just check the... And isn't the qualifying criteria for this gender recognition certificate still a long one that's based on pathologizing being trans and depends on proving you're trans enough to a panel of almost always cis people? I'd have to check that. I'm so sorry. Oh no, wait, I hear we've spoken to some actual trans people. Okay, and they've asked if we can maybe update the Gender Recognition Act a bit. Okay, that's actually fair enough. We can just quickly take this off the shop. Okay, we're creating some mise-en-scène right now with red, the colour of danger. Okay, so because of these complaints from trans people, the UK government announced a review of the GRA, including the idea of self-ID, which would allow people to obtain a gender recognition certificate through a legal declaration, replacing the existing medicalised lengthy process that required a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. This was a policy that had been introduced in some other European countries. It was kind of regarded as the best practice by trans people at the time. Alongside this, the Parliamentary Women and Equalities Committee proposed around 30 recommendations, which included self-ID, but also things like better training for NHS staff. And there is, I believe, somewhere in the multiverse, a glorious alternate timeline in which none of what I'm about to tell you happened, and instead the government just went, trans people, we're listening to you, let's update that act. Unfortunately, we live in this timeline, so this is what happened instead. You hear all of this and you're like, wow, what could possibly have gone wrong? Because things did go wrong. Almost none of these things were implemented because in the wake of the committee's suggestions, transphobic organisations and websites sort of emerged and the moral panic began. Now, it's important to point out here that the gender recognition certificate that started all of this had wildly limited applications. Like the aforementioned birth and death certificates, along with having your gender reflected on marriage and civil partnership documentation, and some pension and insurance provider records that you needed the certificate to be able to update those. That's kind of it. That's they don't allow you to access certain spaces like toilets or changing rooms or gyms or sport clubs or refuges or other resources. They didn't require you to see one. Most people would use them a few very limited times in their lives. Those times are very significant to that person, but they're limited. Which, if you have been, catching up with the trans moral panic of the last few years, you might be surprised by, because that kind of isn't the vibe that is really given on how important self-ID is. Section 28 might have only been about promoting homosexuality and only in certain schools technically, if you followed the wording of the act. It shouldn't technically have affected protecting students from bullying. But that was the reality of the impact of the clause and its backlash. And we can see the same kind of thing happen with the proposed changes to the GRA. Because it suddenly became about supposed concern about safety, claiming self-ID would enable predators in single-sex spaces like toilets and changing rooms, because men could falsely declare themselves to be women to invade women's spaces and harass them, potentially leading to violence against women. And even though these spaces don't require birth certificates to access them, which is the thing that self-ID will be able to alter, this was a successful strategy and talking point within the moral panic. Even though, again, trans people had access to these spaces for decades without issue, and in countries that had adopted this system already, like Argentina, Belgium, Malta, Denmark, Colombia, Norway, Ireland, and Portugal, the cases just hadn't happened. But that kind of reality doesn't really matter in the case of a moral panic, right? The mainstream media's transphobic coverage began in earnest in 2017 and was spearheaded by The Times, notably journalist Janice Turner, followed soon after by Andrew Gilligan. Janice's transphobic opinion columns meant that accuracy or fairness wasn't required. So this initial concern over self-ID then has crept into so many other areas, creating these new fears around trans people, gender non-conforming people, even drag artists, like the trans women's participation in sport panic or drag queens storytime in libraries panic. Because it's important to note that technically the initial sort of worry, at least publicly, seemed to be the idea of like cis men taking advantage of this new ruling. But then increasingly, it became this implication and sometimes outward admission that essentially what they actually believe is that trans women, because this largely focuses around trans women, are themselves men trying to invade women's spaces. Like, the fear isn't actually cis men taking advantage of the self-ID policy, but trans women themselves. And we see this clearly in the reporting of things like the trans-inclusive policy of girl guiding, with talk of potential risks to cis girls from their trans friends on overnight trips. Like, the implications are clear. It's these trans children who are the risk, not someone taking advantage of the self-ID laws, as was initially suggested. And if you saw the coverage of this self-ID issue at the time, you'd have been forgiven for thinking that this was like a long-held belief of like very real proven danger. Those flooding social media and news sites with anti-trans rhetoric was speaking, what everyone had been thinking. But that simply isn't true. Reactionaries construct popular support rather than respond to popular demand and grievances, claiming to speak on behalf of the people that left behind or a silent majority. Reactionaries have made this a widely accepted trope in much mainstream discourse, even though such tropes have no tangible measure and or are often proven wrong or inaccurate by most serious studies. For example, in our case, organised transphobic discourse generally claims to speak on behalf of women, who it claims are threatened by both trans activists who seek to undermine women's right to speak out, as well as more generally by trans women's access to spaces such as women's public toilets or refuges. It's been demonstrated that these views do not represent most women. Yet this powerful pseudo-democratic argument has allowed them to gain prominence. Okay, so there was this big consultation around the GRA that happened in 2018, and the results came out in 2020. And despite the fact that the response was overwhelmingly in favour of self-ID and trans equality more generally, the results were essentially ignored. And it was instead announced that the GRA reform would only consist of a reduction in the cost of applying to GRCs and the ability to apply online. But the effects have ultimately been much wider than the GRA itself, right? So in 2020, for example, we also saw the judgment from the Bell versus Tavistock judicial review come down. This resulted in decreased access to puberty blockers for trans young people, with even those already receiving them having to petition the courts to stay on them. Currently, the NHS states that puberty-suppressing hormones are not available to children and young people for the treatment of gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. And what I think is even more alarming is that just this week, The Guardian reported that despite protests around this all being about protecting children and insisting that they don't know what they want and the issue is their age and that's what we're trying to protect, the NHS is continuing to examine the evidence for masculinizing and feminizing hormones in adults. The impact of the trans moral panic was evident in the responses to my survey. One respondent told me, "I got kicked out of my home and am now more or less homeless. This happened a little less than a year ago. I've been having panic attacks for about 3 years now, usually around 3 times a week, but very often I have one every day." Another said, "I used to swim in a binder and no one would have an issue. I would make small talk with the older people. I get told I have an old soul often and I'm very friendly and easy to talk to. I was waiting in the changing rooms that are semi-open to the pools. Individual lockers and the hallway is open view to the pool. I'm there with my carer. My carer doesn't have an issue with me being trans, but she spots some children are having a swimming class. She's worried about something, and she tells me that maybe we should wait somewhere else until the kids are out of the pool. I think she was worried that one of the parents would assume I'm there to look at children rather than swim because I'm gender non-conforming. I don't swim anymore. What does a moral panic look like? Let's go with another warning colour. Let's go orange. I actually don't know if it's going to show up any difference, but we're still in the weeds, unfortunately. But I will, spoiler alert for later in this video, we will be moving on to green, which is some positives. So stay tuned. Okay, so as we'd expect from a moral panic, the trend has been to paint trans people as threatening based on misinformation, disinformation, and simplification. Remember those we talked about earlier? So let's have a look at some headlines that make this pretty obvious, I would say. Okay, so I want to focus for a second on one of these examples. The claim that there has been a 4,415% rise in girls wanting to change sex last year. If you're reading that at face value, that's pretty shocking. It's like, oh, that's actually quite a lot, right? And if you've been primed by these other articles and opinion pieces to see trans people as dangerous and predatory and wanting to recruit children, like that's out and out alarming. But here's the thing. One, trans people are obviously not trying to recruit children, but also when you dig into that statistic, you realize it doesn't really have a basis in fact. And I know that because I saw that headline and I thought, that doesn't seem right, maybe. Or that seems like a simplification. What's the real story here? So I did do some digging. And this is what I found. And when you dig in, you realize that it doesn't really have a basis in fact. As far as anyone seems to be able to tell, the number originated in a submission to Parliament by a transphobic lobby group called Transgender Trend. And in that submission, they claim that they are concerned over the rise of over 4,000% of referrals to the Tavistock over the last 8 years of girls who develop gender dysphoria at or after puberty. Oh, this claim is given no citation, by the way, in the submission to Parliament. But we can look at the referral rates to Tavistock, and if you compare the stats for 2011 to 2012 and 2019 to 2020, it goes from 111 to 1,915. So that's a rise of around 1,600%. I'm pretty sure, if my maths is right. And that's still a large number, but it's not 4,000%. And I will also point out that an increase of a small number is still a small number. Like we're talking about under 2,000 young people, right? In fact, statistically, I think we expect for there to be a lot more referrals if large population study data is correct, and around 1% of the population could be trans. You know, there are around 14 million like under 18s in the UK. So I would expect there to be more than 2,000 referrals. And so the story here to me is actually maybe a lack of funding and provisions for the many young trans people who clearly haven't been able to make it even to the referral stage, right? These scaremongering headlines, however, aren't isolated incidents. So the Times and the Sunday Times in just 2020 ran over 300 articles on trans people. Like that's almost one a day, right? There's also other papers that accepted like advertising from campaign groups around the Gender Recognition Act and like the trans issue. I think the Metro had like a full page ad urging the public to like resist this dangerous reform. And then there are sort of like cartoonishly ridiculous examples that would be funny if they weren't so not funny. The Daily Star would run stories about Ian Huntley, who is notoriously the murderer of 2 young schoolgirls, claiming that he was trans, and then didn't admit that this was simply not true until like years afterwards. Probably one of the most infamous articles is this one from 2017, when this wave of transphobia was like initially building. So children sacrificed to appease trans lobby is the headline. This was an opinion piece in the Times. Every word of this headline is engineered to heighten fear and anxiety in the reader. We're talking about vulnerable children. We're talking about implied violence of the word sacrifice, the idea of some like sinister, powerful trans lobby demanding this, the threat of what will happen if they aren't appeased. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't realize that this video was gonna become media analysis time, but I fear it has to, because this is how you start to realize what moral panics look like, down to the wire individual word choices. It's this kind of really specific style of manipulation. And also, when we look at these attitudes and headlines around trans people today, it's very easy to compare and see the similarities to the treatment of gay, lesbian, and bi people in previous decades that I haven't already touched on. You know, gay people being sexual predators. The gay lobby was brainwashing children. We were a natural mentally ill going through a phase. Like, the very concept of gay rights was political correctness gone mad. And now we see opponents to trans equality call into question the legitimacy of trans people, dismissing them as confused or deviant or unnatural or predatory or mentally ill. There's this idea that the increase in people claiming trans identities is evidence of brainwashing or some kind of social contagion, rather than visibility allowing people to understand something that has always been a part of them. The idea that children are confused and vulnerable and being taken advantage of has direct parallels to the coverage of things like the campaign to equalise the age of consent in the UK. But here's a plot twist for you, because in this very article, Turner argues that gay people sought only the right to love who they wished, and for that love to receive equal recognition, gay rights had no impact on the rights of anyone else. It's almost laughable, this strange kind of ahistorical whitewashing of the attitudes of the 20th century and beyond. Like, to claim that trans people's agenda is fundamentally different and more sinister when the exact same things were being said about gay people too. This is a quote from a Times column again, but this time from 1991. The price homosexuality exacts in the form of childlessness, instability, and now mortal danger from AIDS is not something that most 16-year-olds have the capacity to evaluate. And in that article, Daly the writer declares herself the least homophobic person alive, and then proceeds to argue against equalising the age of consent because straight 16-year-old boys, too shy to talk to girls, are particularly vulnerable to the pressures of the gay lobby. And soon these innocent young fools will find themselves in a club from which there may be no return. Sound familiar to you? The response to transgender people has been both disproportionate and hyperbolic. Fox News has featured 170 anti-transgender segments in only 3 weeks in 2022. Matt Walsh called gender ideology one of the greatest evils in human history. Dozens of hospitals across the country have had to deal with bomb and death threats against their staff for treating trans youth, while anti-trans protests are frequented by violent far-right groups toting assault rifles and promising death to groomers. Okay, time for a little slight mood change again, because this is the part of the video where I tell you a little story about how I, a very average cisgender woman, found myself embroiled in this trans moral panic when I found myself at the centre of a very public controversy involving my book Here in Queer and the V&A Museum in London. So, settle down everyone, make yourself comfortable, it's story time. In June of 2023, it was reported that my book Here in Queer and another, Seeing Gender by Iris Gottlieb, had been removed from the museum shop of the Yonge V&A, and that a Stonewall poster had been removed from the museum display itself prior to the reopening. So this was a museum that has existed for a long time, and then they decided to do this kind of big revamp. They closed it for a while and then they reopened. But before the reopening, these things got removed. So the initial article that broke the news detailed opposition to these last-minute removals coming from staff at the museum, including the LGBTQIA working group. And it was revealed that the removals had been authorised by the museum's director called Tristram Hunt, just days before the reopening, giving staff no time to reverse or protest the decision before the doors could open to the public. So I was obviously, kind of concerned, sort of angry at this news. For me, it was having this decision come from a museum that is for young people specifically, from an organisation that publicly talks about how they support our community. It was so infuriating because I knew where this had come from, right? It was a reaction to this moral panic. My book is labels as suitable for 14-year-olds, and the museum caters to young people up to and including 14-year-olds. And when the removals were made public in the initial news report, it was through leaked information from someone within the museum union. And at the time, specific age-related concerns weren't mentioned. It wasn't until public scrutiny began that the PR messaging around the age range of my book was introduced as a reason for its removal. And at that point, the messaging became around the only reason why these two books are removed is because they're for 14-year-olds and, there are going to be children younger than 14 in the museum. So, it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. Just mysteriously, it was just 2 trans-inclusive books that got removed. They've also never been in direct contact with me or my publisher about what age-appropriate trans-inclusive books that they've replaced those books with, as I requested. I would contest that that's because it was never around age ratings at all. And at first I was just kind of suspicious in a circumstantial way. And then I had conversations with a number of people who requested that the specifics be sort of off the record, but the general idea could be talked about, where essentially it was revealed to me that there were a number of reasons that were given for the removal that were nothing to do with age range when we're talking about the internal meetings. So do with that what you will. But here's the thing, more than my own book's removal, I am honestly was and still am most concerned about the removal of the Stonewall poster. Specifically, it was a poster that said, "Some people are trans, get over it." These Stonewall posters were designed specifically for young people, for being up in schools. They've been displayed for many years. Initially, the plan for the exhibition seemed to include 2 Stonewall posters on display. And the second one was basically the same. It just read, "Some people are gay, get over it." And it was unclear exactly when the trans poster was removed, but it seems to have been taken down after the installation was complete rather than during the exhibition curation process itself, because there was like a gap in the exhibition that was poster sized. And I think if we haven't already really clocked and focused on the fact that the only difference between these 2 posters, one got removed and one didn't, is the word trans. The deep irony of this is that the poster was acquired for a display that they talk about being around exploring how design can give people a voice. Again, I would love to stress the only difference between this poster that was removed and this one that remains on display is the word trans, meaning that this was evidently the reason for its removal, whatever they say in their official statements. Now, the museum have said in these public statements that they didn't intend for their actions to be exclusionary, that the impact of the actions was exclusionary. Their decision has given credence and support to those with transphobic attitudes. And this was seen directly afterwards on social media, where transphobic accounts were thanking Tristram Hunt, the museum's director, for prioritising the safeguarding of children. The statements from the Young V&A serve to deliberately obfuscate the issue with phrases like, these are contemporary topics as a stand-in for specific language, like in trans existence in this case. The narrative around these removals has very much been that they were kind of slipped under the radar somehow, that they had to be removed last minute because they were only included last minute. I know that to be categorically false because I did some investigating at the time and I found that on the V&A's own website, there are blog posts which are created by museum curators which talk about different pieces that they have acquired for their different exhibitions. God bless them. I assume a lot of people don't read these blog posts. I think they're probably just things that are mandatory for funding, things like that, as documentation of the work that they've been doing. But there is documentation of the Stonewall posters being acquired for the exhibition at least a year before the museum's opening. And I also knew about my book's inclusion in the museum shop for over a year before this happened, because I happened to go to an event that, let's just say, the people making the statements for the Young V&A couldn't have known about when they implied that this was a last minute decision to include these books. I went to an event where the Young V&A were there, and it just so happened that one of the people who was a buyer, curator, for the book collection for that museum shop recognized me and told me that they were buying the book for the museum. This was a plan that they were already thinking of. They were like, I'm really excited to bring this book to the shop. So again, not a last minute decision. The last minute decision I would propose happened when potentially there was some pressure or some opinions from Mr. Tristram Hunt, who is said to have himself gone around and personally overseen these removals. Okay, there's a lot more to this story. I published a statement at the time laying out the full series of events and my concerns and questions that I had for the V&A, which I will leave in the description if you want to read the full thing. To this day, though, never had a reply from them about that statement and never got answers to any of those questions. And as I read some of the responses to my survey, I realised I was very much not alone. In fact, there was one response that was incredibly familiar. I was outed as an 11-year-old in my new secondary school. I was ostracised from my friend group of all girls, banned from PE because people's parents complained about me being in the changing room with other girls my age, and left with no support from teachers because they too felt disgusted by my very existence as a queer kid. I didn't share my sexuality for years after, felt terrified and ashamed of being queer, and really struggled making friends and close relationships because of that extreme reaction to an already traumatic event. I'm 26 and have never even kissed another person because I'm still so deeply ashamed of being queer. That was all that was hammered into my head at a pivotal time in my development. In the responses to my survey, people also opened up about the effect of other moral panics. I'm not a direct target of the immigration panic, but would like to share the experiences of my significant other who is. 2 of his family members have been deported over the last year. A couple others have self-deported to avoid the trauma of being taken by ICE. He's under constant stress and fear that his mum or brothers will be taken. Every time we go out, we're on the lookout for ICE. I never go anywhere without a whistle. We've had a couple of close calls. These are all just regular people living regular lives who happen to be from somewhere else, and now they must be in constant paranoia and caution. It's been awful for his mother's physical and mental health. It has all just been harrowing. Okay, so at this point, I think it's become pretty clear the damage that moral panics can do to individuals and communities. But there is another side to this coin, and that is, who is benefiting from them? Who is making them happen? Why? So the widespread nature of moral panics means that there are actually many people who believe and spread the panic who don't get any direct or specific benefits from it. They feel this emotional reaction to hearing about a folk devil, and it becomes a genuine concern, and then they react accordingly. But there are also people who are often deeply involved in the creation and sustaining of these panics who do see benefits beyond just calming their own fears. So first, let's consider the benefits of social power, the ability to shape societal norms. Moral panics, as we've seen, are often a way of maintaining the status quo, of punishing those who step outside of the bounds of traditional acceptability or who try and make changes to what is considered normal. And so we can see how some argue that these panics are explicitly used to achieve political hegemony. In more modern examples from the last century, the moral panic is not an isolated phenomenon, but a connective strategy for moral campaigns and the cultural politics and hegemony of civil society in late 20th and early 21st century social life. So, utilizing strong emotional reactions, this mix of fear, anger, and confusion, the people invested in flattening ideas of an acceptable way of behaving, living, and loving can use moral panics to keep that definition of acceptable as narrow as possible. And because of the emotional rather than logical nature of these panics, their claims don't necessarily have to actually make society any less afraid, confused, or angry. Indeed, moral panics can create and sustain contradictory accusations around the folk devil. So, I don't know, for example, that trans people are both enforcing gender roles, but also dismantling gender roles at the same time, and that both of these are very wrong, scary, and bad. Trans exclusionary groups and individuals in the UK are able to use the trans moral panic to spread what was a much more limited anti-trans ideology at the time, rather than picking up the cause as a mandate from the people, as it were. They claim to speak on behalf of the people, in this case often certain women, against an elite which seeks to grant unfair rights and privileges to a mostly silent and silenced minority, even though said rights are precarious and limited, and power is rarely on their side. When you control the public discourse and therefore public opinion, you're much more better able to push for legislation that aligns with your view of how the world should be. Although there's perhaps the outward messaging of anti-trans activists as a single issue grassroots movement that's only about protecting women and children, behind the scenes reality of their funding and political alignments actually tells a very different story. So notoriously anti-trans organization WOLF, or the Women's Liberation Front in the US, received funding from conservative Christian organization, the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is also an anti-choice advocacy group. Now, there's one reading of this, which is that there are anti-trans actors from within this moral panic who from the very start have been aligned with these wider conservative politics. And so this donation in that case kind of demonstrates a natural connection between the individuals within these campaigns. But you could also see these donations as specifically the decision of the donor, the Alliance Defending Freedom in this case, in which case the anti-trans movement is itself aligned with and beneficial to anti-reproductive rights groups and religious campaigns, regardless of what the anti-trans activists believe themselves. But regardless of whether the group being donated to intends to do work benefiting this other movement, it's immaterial, right? Because they still seem to be benefiting. And this isn't the only example of links between these groups. Additionally, it was recently exposed that the LGBT Alliance UK shares an office space with a number of far-right think tanks. In Australia, the 2023 tour of anti-trans lobbyist Kelly J. Keane was sponsored by Conservative Political Action Conference. Additionally, a number of prominent anti-trans campaigners spoke at the CPAC conference later in the year. So some reporting on these connections have referred to it as the far-right co-opting the anti-trans movement, but I think that gives the heart of the trans panic too much credit. I think the desire to police gender freedoms, LGBTQ+ self-expression, and the experience of womanhood is already naturally aligned with the far-right's cultural agenda, especially when we consider the leaked emails. Because we don't entirely have to guess what happens behind the scenes, because in 2023, over 2,600 emails from anti-trans organizations in the US have been leaked to the public, giving insight as to how these groups have collaborated on anti-trans legislation. What it shows is that TERF groups, far-right think tanks, anti-LGBTIQ+ organizations, conversion groups, and known actors in the disinformation wing were collaborating on messaging and political strategy regarding bills to outlaw gender-affirming care for minors at least as far back as 2019. I think it isn't a coincidence that a lot of these connections of funding and support are not openly discussed. There isn't a sense of open coalition in many cases, because the far-right elements of the anti-trans movement understand that this is a Trojan horse opportunity. Many far-right beliefs are obviously antithetical to things like equality movements, that many people consider necessary norms of society. Even those who know nothing about trans people, if presented with a simple declaration of we should restrict trans rights or remove trans healthcare, would say, well, no, I don't really know about trans stuff, but that seems bad because I'm for equality. But the anti-trans movement can lean on the idea that trans people themselves are a threat to women's equality and safety, and by doing so, swing the beliefs of those who consider themselves morally left-wing. I think I saw this pattern quite a lot with middle-class straight white men in the UK over the last few years. Public figures who made statements about being concerned about the trans debate or the trans issue because they saw themselves as one of the good guys who supported women's rights. This kind of surface-level understanding of feminism, wrapped up in equality being a hypothetical that these men believed in as a political position rather than a reality that they fully understood, meant that they were easily swayed by claims that transphobia was itself a feminist thing to be and do, whereas in reality, organised transphobia describes a top-down movement that relies on prominent platforms and privileged access to shaping public discourse to divert attention away from the real struggle most women and LGBTQ+ people are facing conjointly, but also from the deeply reactionary and threatening nature of transphobia. This positioning of transphobia as an open form of inequality in leftist spaces, in a way that few other inequalities would be, gives useful context to how it became acceptable, but also even if TERFs were left-wing pioneers of equality in every other area, the transphobia itself is enough. It's all connected, right? We can see the attempts of shaping moral life and cultural politics in the ways that political funding has been intertwined with moral politics. In 2023 in Quebec, for example, in public, the CAQ is distancing itself from PDF Quebec, a group that advocates for conversion therapy and targets trans women online. In private, they've awarded them $500,000 in government money. In this case, we have a few possibilities for how this happened. One is that the Quebec government is knowingly funding anti-trans organisations in order to further their political goals, spreading right-wing and conservative ideas as a norm. But we also have the possibility that the government didn't know the true nature of the organisation. After all, when you look it up, the kind of headline is that they're trying to promote real equality between men and women. So you'll be forgiven for thinking that maybe the organisation actually does focus on work that will realistically protect women and girls. Maybe this was just a terrible mistake. In that case, we can understand the concealing of moral panic advocacy within wider work, or even just outward branding, is extremely powerful. In this way, to question the work of an organisation becomes to question women's equality work itself. This example leads us onto the second potential benefit, which is political power, because the drive of many moral panics eventually becomes political change through laws or governmental guidance. And so engaging in moral panics is a form of professional currency for politicians. Moral panics are an excellent key issue to rally a voting base around, showing you care about something that feels like an immediate threat, your fingers on the pulse, you have strong opinions about this very important issue, and the strength of your convictions means that you are a safe person for the public to put their trust in. It can also be used to back up existing platforms. So, you're a tough on crime politician who's running on a campaign of higher prison sentences and tough policing. Well then, a moral panic about youth riots and lawless gangs is the perfect justification. It's more impactful than bland stats from a YouGov survey. You can just point to the headlines and be like, see? We're all thinking it. Something has to be done, and I'm the one who's willing to do it. And it can also be used against political opponents who occupy these marginalised folk devil groups to reignite fear through suggestion. Consider Mamdani's mayoral race in New York. The city's first Muslim mayor, his opponent Cuomo, did not shy away from directly invoking the Islamophobic post-9/11 moral panic of the 2000s in his campaign. God forbid another 9/11. Can you imagine Mamdani in the seat? The independent candidate and former governor told the conservative radio talk show host Sid Rosenberg, referring to the 2001 terrorist attacks on New York City by Islamic extremists. He'd be cheering, Rosenberg replied, prompting Cuomo, who has previously referred to Mamdani as a terrorist sympathizer, to laugh and announce, "That's another problem." One of the most well-known pieces of scholarship on moral panics was Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order by Hall et al. In 1979. It's a piece that could have been written about the phenomenon every few years of crime-related moral panics giving rise to an increase in surveillance, policing, and prison support. They examined the discursive loop by which the public's frightened reactions to media reportage were then fed back to the police and politicians as indicators not just of public opinion, but also of public support for augmenting the control culture by increasing arrest rates for muggers, passing new laws, and raising maximum terms for prison sentences. Remember those leaked emails that we talked about earlier? A big part of what they reveal is how these moral panics instigators were not just a direct contact with politicians, but were heavily involved in the introduction and drafting of legislation. On a Saturday afternoon in August 2019, South Dakota Republican State Representative Fred Deutsch sent an email to 18 anti-trans activists, doctors, and lawyers with the text of a bill he planned to introduce that would make it a felony for doctors to give transgender children under 16 gender-affirming medical care. I have no doubt this will be an uphill battle when we get to session, Deutsch warned the group. As always, please do not share this with the media. The longer we can fly under the radar, the better. The leaked emails reveal how Deutsch's proposal helped proponents of the national movement to restrict gender-affirming care establish a playbook for their now common attacks. This is not a politician interested in the interests of trans people, in understanding their needs and concerns and engaging with a wide range of constituents in what is needed to improve their lives. In fact, the president of the American Principles Project, a member of the coalition, recently told the New York Times that his group's goal is to eliminate all transition care, starting with children, because that's where the consensus is. Now, I have no doubt, unfortunately, that a lot of the politicians who have drafted the countless anti-trans bills have genuine transphobic beliefs that they are compelled to enforce as law. But there's also the possibility of using anti-trans movements and other moral panics as a political distraction technique. Some folk devils become the reason for your suffering. For example, that immigrants are taking all the jobs, encourages you not to look, at wider reasons for economic inequality. Other times it's a way of creating a villain to create a kind of shield that can deflect away from the reporting of genuine governmental mistakes or other social issues. So these first two benefits of social power and political power align with the beginning and end stages of moral panics we talked about at the beginning of the video, like the introduction of the folk devil all the way to the changes of laws and legislation it results in. But the third and final benefit I want to talk about is the sort of messy middle, the spread of the moral panic and how it's sustained, which is money. So obviously there is the work of what are called moral entrepreneurs, individuals and groups who deplore and seek to eliminate deviant behavior. In today's world, moral entrepreneurs are able to crowdfund their work as well as create a public brand for themselves as lucrative speakers and tastemakers and columnists around this one obsessive topic. But this isn't just about the profit potential for individuals. The moral panic machine is powered by the profit potential for the media that spreads the message. Without the traditional mass media, niche publications, and more recent social media development, a moral panic doesn't really exist. It's a key step in the process that these supposed dangers are reported on and spread through the community, whether local or global. They have to create the simplified and symbolic imagery of the folk devil and their threat for it to be spread. So if we know that moral panic coverage will, one, be disproportionately high in terms of how often and how much space is given to the story, 2 will be sensationalist in its language and scope, and 3 will focus on sparking negative emotions in the reader, then it's crucial to understand that the current financial model of news reporting incentivizes all three, because the money primarily comes from circulation and advertising. Circulation means that you have to ensure that you are the paper that people choose on the newsstand above all others. You need a front page headline that grabs people. You need to make them feel like they have to read on. And advertising means, in our world of online news, that you have to keep people there. You have to generate enough content online to feed readers an endless stream of stories. You need to utilize an algorithm or tagging features on your site that will suggest related content. And you need a volume of related content to serve them when that happens. So I used to work at a website that ran a newsroom, as well as opinion and feature pieces. And every day we would have to come in and pitch 5 or more stories at the beginning of the day that we'd found from different sources like social media and other publications. Because gone are the days of long form investigative reporting as the norm for journalists. Now it's about getting out as many stories as you can. And what counts as a story is often defined simply as a thing that people are talking about. And while some publications attempt to gain readers through a sort of loyal specific outlook, others attempt an impossible balancing act of appealing to the range of political views by showcasing clashing extremes. Liberal-leaning outlets like the New York Times helped anti-trans panic catch fire under a veil of objectivity and through misleading both sides reporting. Outlets like The Times didn't just capitalize on transphobic rhetoric, they actively legitimized it and spread it to new audiences. And the New York Times didn't just come under scrutiny from those on the outside looking in. In February 2023, over 1,000 current and former New York Times contributors signed an open letter expressing serious concerns about editorial bias in the newspaper's reporting on transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. The letter condemned the outlet's coverage, highlighting that the Times has in recent years treated gender diversity with an eerily familiar mix of pseudoscience and euphemistic charged language, while publishing reporting on trans children that omits relevant information about its sources. Ironically, its own reporting had helped create a culture where pro-trans beliefs or even neutral trans beliefs were seen as inherently political, leading to this response. The next day, New York Times executive editor Joe Kahn circulated a newsroom memo defending the Times and chastising the contributors who spoke out against it. Participation in such a campaign is against the letter and spirit of our ethics policy, Kahn asserted. We do not welcome and will not tolerate participation by Times journalists in protests organised by advocacy groups. The very same day, the Times published an anti-trans op-ed entitled In Defense of J.K. Rowling. For a long time now, the media coverage of LGBTQ+ people has been profoundly important to the fight for our rights and respect. News media, and fictional media for that matter, has an impact on social attitudes, because when we talk about marginalised and minority groups in particular, this media can provide information that people assume is trustworthy about whole communities that they have no real-world frame of reference for. Meaning for those who don't know someone from that group that's being demonized, they have no counter-reference, and that trust is all too often betrayed in the interests of profit. How to spot a moral panic. Okay, sorry, that was a lot. Very overwhelming, very, dare I say, panic-inducing. It's easy, I think, to see a moral panic from years ago and think, how ridiculous, who believed that about Dungeons and Dragons? How silly. You know, that satanic panic idea that the average suburban neighborhood in homes and businesses everywhere, there was a dark wave of Satanists carrying out ritualistic sacrifice on children, and somehow metal music and, paladin elves were to blame. But it did have a very real impact, including people found guilty of these supposed crimes that they didn't commit, who went to prison. There is an excellent documentary, one of my favourite actually, on the subject of one particular case called West of Memphis, which is about 3 teenagers who were found guilty of the murder of 3 young boys in the 1990s. And the most interesting thing that the documentary does is it spends the first half of the film laying out all of the reasons why you should believe that these teenage boys absolutely 100% were guilty of committing a Satanist ritualistic murder. You know, the evidence the jury were given, footage from the time, expert evidence, this is all given to you. But then halfway through the movie, they reveal that they actually never committed the murder. And what follows is all of the ways that the public and the jury have been manipulated, misled, and influenced by the moral panic of the time to such a degree that they sent these 3 to prison for years. They were falsely imprisoned, and the second half of the film is essentially the campaign to get them justice. I think it's just such a smart decision from the filmmakers to construct the documentary like that, right? Because what it does is put you in the shoes of the jurors. This isn't a case where we're looking at, oh, how could the jurors ever think that? That's so ridiculous. Obviously, these people were innocent. It's showing you, no, this is the playbook. This is exactly how they were persuaded that they were guilty. And you see how easy it would have been for anyone to have come to the same conclusion at the time. In the survey I sent out, I asked people if they'd ever believed in moral panics. And a lot of people had, even people who themselves have been victims of other moral panics. I don't think it helps anyone to demonize those sucked into the world of moral panics. There are a lot of reasons why someone might be. It might be that a moral panic aligns with an existing bias, even an unconscious one, something you've been taught a long time ago by family members, or a cultural bias left over from previous moral panics, or maybe an individual experience that's bolstered by a moral panic to make statements about an entire group of people. The re-emergence of this fear can then become a kind of confirmation bias that these ideas have been right all along. And I'm not saying that's right, but I do think it's important that we understand how that can happen. Similarly, as we've covered already, it might be that it seems to align with an existing positive belief system. So, the case of feminism and transphobia being explicitly linked in the modern trans moral panic. You might have opinions from those pushing the moral panic appear in your social media algorithm as reality and truth without any counter ideas to be able to counteract it. You might have an existing fear and confusion that becomes neatly packaged by a moral panic with a specific group to blame that ironically can kind of bring you a sense of security. Your fear might be real, but the reason for it isn't. You might also just be outside of the issue, repeating knowledge without necessarily having investigated or critically thought about it because it doesn't seem that deep. You might be persuaded by the specific rhetorical devices used in moral panics. Conversion narratives, for example, are when a spokesperson for a panic admits that they used to think the opposite, that trans people or Muslims or sex workers or whoever the panic is about are like, oh, we used to think they were actually fine, but then I saw the light and I realized I was wrong and the panic is real. Within organized transphobia, considerable effort goes into soliciting and sharing peak trans stories, with the aim not only of bolstering in-group solidarity, but also of piquing others. In both movements, awakening is central to both their self-understandings and their recruitment processes. This performative humility gives the impression of open discourse and reasonable arguments on the side of the moral panic, which is so obvious that, it could win over even staunch non-believers like me. So how would you know you're in a moral panic? You might look at when they start to occur. So is it around a time when a group is advocating for themselves or their rights? Is it emerging around an important election? Is it displacing a bigger story in the news? Is the appearance of this story quite sudden? And is the potential folk devil simplified in the media? Are there potentially exaggerated dangers that aren't in line with actual statistics, or real dangers which are given a narrow group to blame, which excuses the impact of wider social decisions and policies? Is there a feeling that coverage of an issue is trying to evoke in you? As we've mentioned already, emotions in moral panics are key. If you're feeling these in yourself or you can see them being stoked in others, then you might be in a moral panic, particularly when targeted against a marginalized group. These can include anxiety and fear, anger and frustration, confusion, humiliation, or loyalty. Ask yourself, do these emotions appear? Are they being exploited? Are they potentially manufactured from scratch? And are they being redirected? Often in moral panics, they give people a logical reason for an inner feeling that would otherwise be turned towards the self or those in power, or else would reveal to the self their own internal biases. Therefore, it's easier to just place that cause of emotion, that blame, onto another. And beyond emotions, consider the messaging that you might hear. What kind of emotive language is being used? Are you seeing absolutist statements, exaggerated descriptions, hidden implications? Are you able to spot techniques like the slippery slope argument? We can see this in the coverage of the equal marriage debates in the US, for example. Contemporary moralizers still argue that if marriage is legalized for gay men and lesbians, Americans will want incest, bestiality, and other horrors legalized. You can also ask if these sources are discouraging allyship using those same in-out group fears. Are you changing your behavior out of that fear? Do people speak out against the violations of rights and citizenship, especially at the beginning of a moral panic? Sometimes yes, and sometimes when fears are heightened, as with parents who feel weird if they defend sex education against its fanatical enemies, the answer is no. And then similarly, are the viewpoints of moral panic supported by ideologies that you don't agree with, and can you determine why? Transphobic discourse, on the other hand, often resorts to more or less crude biological arguments, which echo traditional fascist fantasies of nature and the body. It's no surprise, therefore, to see extreme right and fascist groups supporting these positions, which could easily be extended to other traditional exclusionary politics based on race or ability, a point made abundantly clear when neo-Nazis joined a Posey Parker rally in Melbourne in 2023. As highlighted earlier, whether transphobes actively hold extreme right or fascist views is irrelevant. What matters is that their construction of the people from often mainstream and prominent positions gives credence to the extreme right and fascist narrative that the people can be neatly divided based on essentialist and immutable biological norms, and that the other can be oppressed or excluded and their rights denied on this basis. Yeah, that was a lot of different hypotheticals. So I thought we could deep dive into a specific moral panic moment to give a kind of case study in how to critically engage with and examine what you could be seeing within a moral panic. For this example, we're going to be looking at another fun, cool and sexy piece of guidance released by the UK government in 2023 called Gender Questioning Children, Draft Schools and Colleges Guide, which makes suggestions for how schools can deal with, and this is a direct quote, gender identity ideology. It gets released. Immediately, we can look at those that might be affected and see their reaction. And what we see is that it's criticised by LGBTQ+ organisations and charities across the board. We can also look at who drafted the legislation and see that no trans organisations have been consulted on the guidance either. Okay, so that gives us a sense of potential biases in the guidance and also the mindset of the authors. But we can also look at the guidance ourselves and see what we think. Okay, so the guidance includes a suggested 3-step process for teachers if a student comes out to them, which is watchful waiting, informing the parents, and considering other factors. Watchful waiting, that's basically doing nothing. So a student comes to you, says, I think I might be trans. Basically, you just have to do nothing. If we look at how this is described in the guidance, not described about how long that waiting should last, what the process is with following up with the student, kind of just assumes that the student will sort of never mention it again. The implication being that, oh, it's because they've grown out of it. If they don't come back and talk to you, they've changed their mind, as opposed to being like, well, now the young person doesn't feel safe talking to you because you did not do anything, didn't affirm them, anything like that. Okay, so part 2, informing parents. So again, the guidance seems to give no sort of guidance on how to evaluate how much of a safeguarding risk this might be. And also doesn't really justify why the parents would need to be informed of even the child just questioning their gender, kind of implying that even questioning your gender is a safeguarding risk, which it's not. And then the other factors. So these are factors like getting parental opinion on the young person and whether the parents will let them change their name, for example. Also, the age of the student as well. And then, other factors, other influences that might have been part of this sort of identity discovery, like social media or their social groups, implying that basically if they like follow anyone who's trans on social media or have any friends who might be trans, then that could be a cause of suspicion. And then also what impact it might have on the school community for this child to be trans. And then at the end of the process, the school should only allow social transition in exceptional cases. So social transition, right? We talked about this earlier in the video. So allowing the child to change the name and pronouns that they're referred to as within the school. Because indeed, supporting students by simply using their chosen pronouns or name is talked about in the guidance as specifically an issue of staff deciding whether the benefit to the child can be weighed up against the impact on the school community. And they conclude, it is expected that there will be very few occasions in which a school or college will be able to agree to a change of pronouns. Now, this has a serious knock-on effect because effectively in the UK, if you couldn't socially transition, then you couldn't medically transition. As for many, social transition is part of the proof that let them access medical transition through the NHS. And so this decision within a school would potentially impact a young person way into the adulthood as well. So when we're evaluating this particular piece of legislation that seems to have come from a moral panic, we might want to cross-reference with, like information from the needs of the community in question. So in this case, we can find out that unfortunately, as research like that conducted for the charity Just Like Us suggests, circumstances where outing might pose a risk to the child are actually not rare at all, as suggested in the guidance. So 39% of non-binary and 37% of trans young adults said that they weren't confident that they would be accepted when they came out to their family. And 19% of trans people and 23% of non-binary people told researchers that they weren't close to members of their immediate family. However, to me, I think the most insidious part of this guidance is the refusal of the authors to use the words trans and non-binary to describe these young people, instead referring to them as gender questioning throughout the document. Now, on the surface, this can be seen as like, this is frustrating. It seems sort of like annoyingly petty. It shows a lack of respect and understanding, but maybe other areas of the guidance seem more pressing. But this isn't just about semantics, because it means that there is an argument that the suggestions in the guidance can circumnavigate the safeguards put in place by UK law, specifically the fact that gender reassignment is a protected characteristic under our Equalities Act. It also mirrors the strategies of US groups in those leaked emails. Richard Mast of Liberty Counsel separately advised the group to avoid saying the words transgender, cisgender, or non-binary. Using them surrenders the language, Mast wrote. If the other side's language frames the debate, we lose. Meaning that you could potentially, within your guidance, suggest things that would go against equality law if you're to acknowledge that these young people were trans, because then they would be under a protected characteristic. But by utilizing the language that's outside of the scope of the Equality Act, you essentially don't have to adhere to discrimination and inequality laws at all. So this is very much a strategy that I found when I tried to read some books from the point of view of those stoking the trans moral panic. Honestly, a few of them, just reading like the jacket cover, content page, and author's note would have been enough to write a video essay on themselves. But for the purposes of this video, God, there's so much to write about. We'll just look at one and we'll restrict ourselves. Spoiler alert, we're only going to be getting to things that you can read in this book before you even reach the 7th page number 7, because otherwise there was just too much for us to cover, honestly. I had to restrict myself, and that's where we got to. And that book is this cursed volume, unfortunately a classic of the genre, Irreversible Damage, Teenage Girls and the Transgender Craze by Abigail Schreier. I mean, the title alone. So immediately when you start reading, there is this wild epigraph. Here it is. It reads, "She hides like a child, but she's always a woman to me, Billy Joel." I don't actually know if I need to say anything about that, because I feel like the implications of that, we'll come back to the pronouns of it all in a second, but that just tickled me from the very first. The book also has a number of what's called blurbs before the book actually starts, which are like quotes from other authors or public figures about the book that you're about to read. And normally it's like, this book is amazing, you should definitely read it. And the language is very pointed, let's say. So in various different blurbs, they talk about how these girls need to be rescued, clearly implying a real danger. They describe families who want to deny their children's feelings around their own gender as like being loving parents' efforts to protect them. They describe the idea of young people realizing that they're trans as a new clinical phenomenon, as if it's this sort of unnatural mental health condition that's just sprung up. The book itself begins with an author's note explaining the author will be referring to biologically female teens caught up in this gender craze using she, her pronouns. Whereas for trans adults, she will use their preferred names and pronouns. So there's a bunch of stuff going on just in that one declaration. So first, doing this allows her to create this artificial distinction between the two groups, seemingly sort of unwilling to acknowledge that these trans adults were once these biologically female teens. And also by separating them out and emphasizing the idea that these teens are children, it's possible to couch the entire book as this kind of empathetic, reasonable investigation into like young girls' confused, misled decisions. But here's the gag, gang. She doesn't stick to this supposed reasonable promise. Literally in a section on fellow YouTuber Ash Hardell that's later in this book than page 7, to be fair, she writes, her pronouns are they/them. My God. And then in an example that I kind of had to put the book down for a second and just boggle at this decision. She refers to the murdered trans man, Brendan Teena, who is the subject of the 1999 biopic Boys Don't Cry, using she, her pronouns the entire time. And then has the gall to use Brendan Teena as an example of how a real trans adult who's like suffered enough and transitioned well enough to prove his transness, unlike these teenage girls of today who don't want to dress like real men even though they claim to be trans men. And she says, this is actually on page 7. Okay, so she says, they make little effort to adopt the stereotypical habits of men. They rarely buy a weight set, watch football, or ogle girls. If they cover themselves with tattoos, they prefer feminine ones, flowers, or cartoon animals, the kind that mark them as something besides stereotypically male. They want to be seen as queer, definitely not cis men. My God. There's also this sort of preemptive defense of the book within the foreword, I think, accusing those concerned ahead of the book's release for like the potential damage it could do to vulnerable trans youth as trying to smother the book in its cradle. Like, you don't need to be a linguistics professor to see the implications there, right? Like, utilizing the technique of painting those who lead a moral panic as underdogs fighting to speak against this all-powerful folk devil that's going to murder children. She calls trans boys. The craze we cannot openly discuss in America shows no sign of slowing down. Which is a sentence that she wrote in her own book that is published in America, where she has gone on multiple podcasts as a guest, which is a thing that those guest spots is a thing she talks about only a few pages before this very claim in her own book. Her insistence that her book is kind and good and empathetic is based on the separation of these supposedly mentally ill teenagers with good trans adults who don't talk about being trans and they don't make a fuss and they never struggled beyond a sense of unease and embarrassment, and they instinctively knew what was wrong and then sorted it out without going on about it. Sorry, there's just so much nonsense in this book before you even get to the numbered pages. Like this claim that before 2012, there was no scientific literature on girls ages 11 to 21 ever having developed gender dysphoria at all. It's this classic sort of disingenuous simplification that a lack of funded research implies a lack of existence. If you want to look into the issues with the rest of this book beyond page 7, which is what I got up to for the purposes of for these examples, a simple Google will give you a bunch of fact-checking sources on it that you can look into yourself. But I think that just using examples up until page 7 is enough for you to get the idea of the different ways that moral panic writings and coverage might look, and how you might be able to spot them yourself. You know, easy peasy, right? Well, remember at the start of the video when I was like, oh no, it's gonna get worse. Listen, we got to talk about that now. The reality of the modern internet, from social media usage to AI integrations, is leading to an acceleration and amplifying of the already catastrophic existing moral panic cycle. You know, the personalized algorithms invested in keeping you on a specific platform create a race to the bottom of your attention span, where it's impossible to engage with the material of a moral panic in a way that actually lets you up for air long enough to clock the poison you're being fed. First, let's look at the way that this is affecting the substance and content of a moral panic. It used to be that often it was actual events that were exaggerated at the start of these moral panics. Even those revealed to be untrue afterwards, satanic rituals, were based on an actual crime or a mistaken report by these children that then spiraled. Now we don't actually need real events involved at all. Deepfakes and AI generated content are increasingly creating an uncertainty of truth entirely. In seconds, you can create false ideas, but also dismiss real ideas as false because, well, there's no conclusive proof either way. As using AI as a search engine becomes more common, I think we'll see the effects of AI hallucination appear more as well. That's literally AI just making things up entirely, which is a known issue with AI programs that I feel like we don't talk about enough, especially when using an AI program which is accustomed to your existing views and concerns. Because fundamentally, AI is trained on data, which often has the same biases that were created by historical moral panics in the first place. As I'm saying this, it's so tricky because I am aware of the fact that I don't want to be contributing to more fear being put out into the world. Because I know that as I'm talking about this, people will be clocking onto the fear around a lack of media literacy in the digital age. But the fact is, even if we all had brilliant media literacy, we're approaching a situation where it's going to be near impossible to prove the reality of recorded truth. And so everything becomes uncertain. And I think within uncertainty, naturally for a lot of people, it becomes fear, right? It's this cycle which I'm unfortunately genuinely worried about. And then the issues with the content of moral panics are then added to by the fact that our current use of technology increases the speed, volume, and spread of that content. The specificity of algorithms can inadvertently target those most vulnerable to this misinformation, and the speed of AI content production can create a sense of widespread belief, fear, and danger that is even more disproportionate than we've seen before from moral panics. Because fundamentally, the emotions of moral panics and of social media hooks are the same. We're talking about outrage bait and extreme points of view that are put out there, not necessarily because they reflect what someone thinks, but just to get more clicks. Modern internet usage allows for private discussions and strategizing to be conducted from anywhere in the world, and then deployed on a globalized scale as a public outcry. We've seen this trans moral panic specifically spread to as disparate locations as Spain, Bulgaria, Peru, and Ghana. Those are all countries that have been part of research and academic and journalistic investigations into the trans moral panic phenomenon. We're also in an age of unquestioned sources. Despite us knowing that anyone can post anything on the internet, there's this sense, I think, that something said with authority, especially if it aligns with our worldview, will be true. It's easier than ever to immediately share what we find. And sometimes people's whole deal with their accounts is to repackage things into these very shareable formats. So it's easier than ever to immediately share what we find. And of course, as journalism becomes an ever more precarious profession, advertising clicks, no matter the cost, will continue to pressure news desks. You outcompete your competitors for subscribers, for eyeballs, and for attention. You go with the most sensational headlines. You tap into the emotions and aspects that keep readers and viewers and listeners more plugged into your outlet, Alvarez observed. And the most effective way to do that is through fear and hatred. If people are kept perpetually afraid, if they are made increasingly mistrustful of their fellow citizens and their fellow human beings, then profit-driven outlets are going to ensure a more captive audience that can support its news operation. Alvarez argues that when outlets like The Times manufacture moral panics, they know it's going to keep people's attention. It's going to keep their publication's name in people's mouths. It's going to keep them in the driver's seat of public discourse, regardless of how many human beings it hurts. And then the sheer volume of content on the internet also means that it can be difficult to keep up with the levels of policy. I'm sure a majority of my audience would want to try and combat the trans moral panic, and yet I know that a lot of you would never even have heard of the bunch of the governmental guidance and NHS policy changes and things that we've talked about in the video already. And even fewer will have heard about the consultation processes to try and combat them. Many people now get their news and current affair updates not just from online publications, but individual creators, relying on them to have found these action points and know which ones will have the best impact. The traditional model of charities and advocacy organisations pulling together a press release to go out to mainstream press that reaches the public, it's kind of just a hugely outdated one at this point. And when we look at ways that previous moral panics have been assuaged, it becomes clear that these methods of reversal aren't necessarily replicable anymore either. Take the case of the supposed satanic childcare workers, which were massively impacted by the work of the kind of dedicated investigative reporters in local circulation that we struggle to find now. 2 investigative journalists reported on daycare satanic ritual abuse cases across the country. They found that between the McMartin case in 1983 and the Ballard case in 1987, more than 100 such cases had been investigated, and concluded that in the single-minded pursuit of imaginary satanic ritual abusers, the systems and experts devoted to protecting children had railroaded innocent people and diverted attention and resources from real cases of sexual abuse. It certainly would have been uncommon moral panic that swells and spreads without its share of counterclaims and criticism such as this. But the investigative reports illustrate why their impact should not be underestimated or overlooked. On a local level, the reports created a sea change in public opinion about the Ballard case. Citing the reports in its decision, the appeals court overturned Ballard's conviction, stating that parents, social workers, investigators, and the prosecutor had unduly influenced the nature and content of the children's allegations, and that investigators had improperly destroyed audio tapes of early interviews with some of the children. How to survive a moral panic. Finally! We move on to green. Stunning. Because, you know, at this point, we just got through that last section, and I am more than aware that that information might have been quite worrying, overwhelming. You might even have begun to feel some of those emotions that we have talked about being part of a moral panic, you know, that stoke the moral panic, that you might have been a little afraid, a little confused, a little bit angry, frustrated. But here's where we're going to do something different. Because in this section, we're going to be talking all about how there are ways that we can attempt to combat this. There are ways in which we can try and alleviate moral panics, both on an individual level to avoid being sucked into them ourselves or being affected by them, but also on a wider level, how we can support other people who might be being pulled into it, how we can attempt to combat the legislative measures that they potentially could lead to. So that hopefully we're going to end this video not in a state of emotional devastation. Okay, let's begin. Minimizing moral panics can start very small. We can start with just talking about ourselves. So, what would it mean to build a healthy media diet? If the media is where we're mainly going to be exposed to these kind of moral panics. So to start with, you can minimize your exposure to misinformation and disinformation, right? Which means, and I'm sorry to have to say this, everyone. I myself am guilty of it, but we got to get off social media if you know that it's something that you rely on a lot and that sucks you into a process of doom scrolling. You can delete your accounts if you want to go cold turkey, or kind of having strict rules around your usage, around how often and the volume at which you're engaging, the amount that you're consuming, minimizing your time on the apps. Social media companies will truly do anything to keep you scrolling, and nothing is more effective for engagement than anger and fear, and so these algorithms are inevitably going to push content that provokes these feelings in you. No content can better achieve that goal, to my mind, than moral panic content. And these companies don't necessarily care if that content is misleading, and even if they do, the sheer volume of content that you are going to be coming up against means that it won't all be able to be moderated. So that, I would say, is my first suggestion. But if you do say on social media, which you might actually have to do, a lot of people have to do it for work, then try to ensure that you aren't consuming content passively. If you see a post that seems fake or that disagrees with what you say or makes you feel outraged, then, fact check it against reliable news sources or fact checking sites. If you see a post that seems to be correct, it agrees with what you believe in a way that is validating in some kind of way, I would say check it twice, actually. If you want to share that, check it 3 times or more. Because again, our own biases can persuade us that things that we agree with, maybe even more than things we disagree with, right? If you see a news story or a post that triggers a strong emotional response, take a moment to regulate your body. Take a deep breath, look away from the screen, ask yourself, why did this make me feel angry or scared or smug or confused? Does it present you with a perceived enemy? Is that enemy a historically marginalized group in some way? Is this trying to threaten or undermine your identity or the identity of a loved one? Again, check it with reliable sources. Check it with multiple. And if it's from a reliable news source, are you citing a journalist or a factual piece, or is it an opinion piece which doesn't necessarily have to be true in the way that it's presenting statements that are opinion? Try to keep in mind some of the examples that we looked at during this video. So how are studies and statistics being used? What are they being used to imply? Things like percentage increases, where a small number increases to another small number, but by using the percentage increase rather than the numbers themselves, it can made to look a lot more. Something can double from like 0.05% to 0.1%. Still very small numbers, but the doubling is what is exaggerated, so it's worth digging into the details. Science is itself a process, right? And statistics are tools, and they are tools that can be used badly. And when it comes to particularly alarming statistics, I would say really try and be a filter rather than a sponge in the way that you're consuming that content. If you do share something that you later realize was misleading or even out and out false, come forward and say that. Publicly admit that you were wrong about something. I think that that is deeply admirable, very needed right now, and hopefully will encourage more people to drop the stigma of being fooled by something. They'll start to reflect on their own media behavior. I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting that you've been duped by something or shared something hastily or accidentally, trying to be helpful, it didn't have the intended effect. I think be just as open, maybe even more open about a retraction or a correction as you were with the sharing in the first place. And I guess because I started talking in this section about being like a media consumption menu, then we can also talk about the fact that no diet is complete without dessert. And so I guess the metaphorical dessert here is seeking out good news, because good things do happen. When we increasingly aren't served those stories, actually when we acknowledge them and find them, it becomes a little bit brighter and a little bit easier for us to self-regulate, to counter the negative. So as of me writing this, my lovely co-researcher Isabel decided to give me a list of good things that have happened, which is very sweet, which includes giant tortoises being returned to the Galapagos Islands, scientists finding better ways to degrade plastic, one of the carpenters who repaired the Notre Dame Cathedral after the fire got married there, which is the first wedding there in 30 years, Thailand legalized gay marriage, St. Lucia decriminalised gay sex. Hampstead Ladies Pond upheld their trans-inclusive policy despite horrible transphobic campaigns against it, which is great. Love that pond. Northwestern University invented a tiny pacemaker for newborns that could be inserted via syringe and then dissolves, meaning that no surgery is required. And all of these stories matter and deserve our attention and can remind us, I think, of our own power individually and also as a community. And that's very nice and necessary. So we have the healthy sort of menu. I would also advise engaging with the menu when you're in a good headspace. When your cognitive defenses are down, when it's 1 a.m. and you're doom scrolling, maybe not the best time, because recent studies have sort of suggested that potentially this can increase the likelihood that you might fall for misinformation. So being very aware of ourselves, our brains, what we're thinking and feeling, and what the impulse to look at these sort of doom scrolly, worrying, emotive types of content actually a meaning to us internally. And then potentially, instead of exposing yourself to news every moment that you're awake, dedicate like a consistent part of the day to actively consuming news in a critical and considered way. Okay, so with all of that, you've done the work to kind of protect yourself from being sucked into the whirlpool of a moral panic. But then, you hear someone in the office express concerns about like trans women in the Olympics, despite the fact that they have never expressed an interest in women's sport before at all, or something equally sort of tangential to a moral panic. I thought it'd be useful here to share the experience of some of the people who had themselves been indoctrinated into moral panics from my survey. Being indoctrinated into moral panic is difficult to reckon with. Growing into a teenager and young adult and slowly starting to question the things my parents said was hard and not well received in my household. I'm lucky that I had an open-minded friend group at school that challenged my worldview. If I hadn't had that experience in school of meeting people different to me and experiencing compassion from those outside my household, I don't think I'd have ever reconsidered my viewpoints. It was the absence of information that led me to very briefly believe the moral panic. I was discovering the existence of trans people through online activist spheres and media, and had a pre-existing trust in feminist views, positions, ideology and framework. So I at first didn't question their transphobia, and didn't recognise this hate speech. I misread it as protectiveness. But the combination of a friend mentioning the struggles trans people face, seeing some feminist content on trans people's perspective and existence, and my growing critical thinking made me reconsider my initial position. This is the part where we want to look at how to protect others. And this does mean protecting the people who are the folk devils in the moral panic. But I also think protecting the people who are being sucked in is something that can be equally useful and can have actually huge ripple effects. So at this point, unfortunately, we do need to acknowledge that there have been a lot of people who have studied this kind of idea over the years, and it is quite hard to pull people out of a moral panic, especially when it overlaps with a conspiracy theory. So the satanic panic stuff, for example, while you can help someone in a moral panic, it's very unlikely that you alone are going to be like the sole savior there, right? Ultimately, these people kind of need to save themselves, I guess. So one of my survey respondents who identified as formerly participating in a moral panic themselves wrote, "There's no way to pull someone out of a moral panic. You can show them the evidence, you can counter their beliefs, but they have to be the ones to step out of that panic." And so for a lot of people, the best use of their energy is probably spent protecting folk devils, people who are being directly affected by donating to organizations, volunteering with advocacy groups, and checking in with the sort of resources for political action or social action that are being requested by those groups specifically. So if you're American, for example, the Trevor Project has a guide on how to testify against transphobic and homophobic bills that you can maybe have a look at and see if there's anything that you might be able to help with there. If you have specific skills, so for example, if you're a lawyer or a paralegal, for example, you can volunteer with the Transgender Law Center, who is currently suing the Trump administration over denying trans prisoners healthcare access. I myself volunteer as a youth mentor with an LGBTQ+ youth charity organization that has a lot of trans young persons that use the services. And it's a way in which I like to give back to my community, but it also means that I see the impact of a lot of these moral panics on young trans people, and it allows me to understand and put into context the real impact that this has really had. I asked the respondents to my survey what they thought people could do to help combat moral panics, and here are some of the answers. Talk to people, listen to people who are affected, read, be open to believing others, remember that everyone is human. It was how I was able to change myself. Call out and correct misinformation, whether online or in real life. The conversations aren't comfortable, but so necessary. I'm cis, but I've corrected people in my life when they spew misinformation about trans people. Even just saying, "Where did you hear or read that?" will make people think twice. For example, my boss was talking about some supposed news stories about non-binary people, and I asked him where he saw it, and he said, Facebook. And I was like, so not from a newspaper or anything? And it dawned on him that what he was saying probably isn't true. Get involved in your real life community, mutual aid, form real relationships with marginalized people in your real life, and stop arguing with each other in comment sections on the internet. But all that being said, if you do want to engage with someone who you suspect has been caught up in a moral panic, there are some tips and ideas that we have seen across different advice and articles and studies, things like that, that you might want to consider and see if they might work for the specific people in your life that you are trying to engage with. So the first thing is to consider whether confronting people online publicly is going to be effective at all. For the most part, probably not. I think, you're much more likely to change your aunt's mind in person or even private messages than you are on a Facebook comment thread. The internet breeds sort of arguments online, and they can create cognitive dissonance that mean people double down on the belief that they feel like they have to defend in comments and then dismiss any information that conflicts that belief. And conversations rather than confrontations are going to be much more effective at pulling people out of moral panics potentially. The second thing to think about is curiosity. So making people question, making people curious. People stuck in a moral panic often can escape by starting to question the foundations of the panic itself, for example. So in 2020, the BBC published an article around how you should talk to friends and relatives that believe conspiracy theories. And in it, psychologist Jo Van Byford said, many people who believe in conspiracy theories see themselves as healthy skeptics and self-taught researchers into complex issues. Present this as something that, in principle, you value and share. Your aim is not to make them less curious or skeptical, but to change what they are curious about or skeptical of. In other words, you can validate this sort of idea of skepticism by redirecting it. You can also do this with other emotions like fear. If someone is afraid of children getting hurt by gender-affirming procedures, you can absolutely validate their concern. No one wants to see children be hurt. You also share that fear, but you can redirect the fear to highlight how gender dysphoria is painful, how suicide rates for trans youth dramatically lessen when they have supportive gender-affirming care, allowing them to see trans youth as youth beyond the idea that that is just a way to dismiss their feelings, putting them into the same category as the children who are potentially going to suffer because of this moral panic. You can consider whether this is someone that you know, the types of evidence that they are going to be best engaged with. So maybe you can show them specific consensuses from mainstream organizations or experts. So think about like specific psychiatric associations talking about the fact that transness, isn't a mental illness. That's kind of something there is a consensus on. We can look at studies on, the rate at which patients who are given hormone blockers during adolescence continue gender-affirming care as adults. What are the scientific consensuses? If these are people who are going to value that kind of expertise, are there statistics that you can show them? Equally, they might be the kind of person who is more persuaded by first-hand testimonies, by being able to search out people who are talking about their own experiences online, and that sort of genuine emotive outreach by those people trying to share their experience might have an even more dramatic effect. And you can talk about real people, you can talk about your trans friends, your immigrant friends, talk about people who are being harmed directly because of the moral panic, not as an accusation against that person, but just as kind of a neutral observation around the environment that we find ourselves in. Back in the days of Section 28 in 1987, 3/4 of people felt that same-sex relations were mostly or always wrong. But today, 3/4 of people personally know a lesbian, gay, or bi person, leading to a dramatic turnaround in public opinion. It's harder to be sucked in by stereotypes and exaggerated moral panics when your best mate or sibling is one of the people that you're meant to be so worried about. You can also be open about the times that you've been misinformed, which is kind of using the conversion narrative strategy that a lot of people within moral panics use, but the opposite way around, to assuage people's fears rather than to stoke them. So have conversations around misleading information that you have fallen for or nearly fallen for, and how you realize that they were wrong. If they talk to you about a transphobic news story about like an increase in transitions or, I heard this and that, then you can validate the fact that, that does sound alarming. But I actually looked into it and I found the numbers are like way smaller than what it said. Again, they get them to question their sources while aligning themselves with your concerns. One of the most powerful ways of doing this is getting to know the talking points of a moral panic so that you are able to effectively counter them in the moment. Doing that fact checking kind of ahead of time, as it were, so that those conversations or the ways in which you're engaging with people means that you can come back with that information, with that correction sort of immediately. Because you'll find in moral panics, the same talking points, the same stats and studies are kind of appealed to and thrown out there over and over and over again. And so once you start to look into it and be able to see them, it becomes a lot easier to counter. You can also challenge the foundation and the effects of a moral panic by highlighting the cruelty that they often lead to. The disproportionate element of this, that even if you were to say, okay, I am worried about this is something that we don't have enough data on, I can understand your fear, yes, I heard about that initial incident, to then highlight the fact that it is now leading to such extremes at the end of that moral panic is something that can give a sense of proportionality to people as well. Let them take a step back and really assess like how we got from point A to point B. And I think ultimately what's important to think about is the fact that realistically, it's almost impossible that one conversation with someone who is fully embroiled within this kind of moral panic is going to completely change their mind. But every person who starts to make them question, starts to make them curious. Every small statistic or counter argument that is offered, that they hear or that they see, every person or post they encounter who is countering this narrative that they keep hearing is going to be another drop into a cup that will eventually overspill. Because people can change. Remember that MP who said, with a substantial number of homosexuals dying of AIDS, I think that's probably the best way in the 80s? Well, in 2022, he said this: I want to apologise for the offensive and unacceptable comments I made as an MP in 1996, in particular about Section 28. In retrospect, one of the most harmful pieces of legislation in British history, which prohibited the teaching and knowledge about same-sex relationships in schools, and also the insensitive and ignorant way I spoke about AIDS and homosexuality. What I said then was not all right, and will never be all right, and I feel ashamed of the comments I made, and want to offer my heartfelt apology to everyone I've hurt. I have felt bad about this for many years, and I understand the adverse impact this has had on the LGBTQ+ community and others at the time, and continues to do so. I also want to say sorry to those whose lives and education were harmed at that time. Over the intervening years, I've had a lot of time to reflect on this, especially as I've developed close friendships with a number of gay people, as well as family members who have come out as gay, and realised how wrong I was in making those comments then, some 36 years ago. Clearly, I should have spoken out publicly before now, but I've offered apologies to people who have raised the issue with me both directly and indirectly, and asked for their forgiveness, as well as explaining that I no longer hold those views and have not done so for many years. I am now trying to publicly demonstrate that I have learned the lessons of my past discriminatory behaviour through the actions I have since taken, including recently supporting transgender and same-sex blessings in church, as well as voting to ban the practice of conversion therapy. Creating moral panics and vilifying folk devils makes it that much easier to create justification for authoritarian politics, a rolling back of equality, and a dissolving of solidarity between communities, even those who are victims of other moral panics themselves. Because ultimately, moral panics don't truly protect those meant to be protected. Attacks on trans kids or inner city youth gangs only serve to dehumanize them to a point where they're punished through removal of support, funding, and sometimes active rolling back of legal equalities. Blaming various groups of others for the abuse of children or women in relationships only serves to allow the real statistics around who is actually committing these crimes to go unengaged with. And so hopefully, even if this video has at times made you feel worried or conflicted or angry, the takeaway actions are not that of moral panic, not reactionary dehumanization, but ideas for how to counter these narratives and encourage real kindness and understanding instead. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to help support me make more videos like this one, I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description. If you decide to become a patron, there's a bunch of different perks there, including a private Discord and a recommendation list of things that I have read and seen that I think are really interesting that you might want to check out. And you also will help fund this channel and the work that I do, which I am extremely grateful for. Please, any thoughts that you have on this, I would love to hear them in the comments. I always really love the kind of thoughtful ideas that you put in there, even when you are disagreeing with me and things that I've said, or you have other thoughts, or you think I've missed out a sort of angle. Love, love, love to hear them in the comments. And I will leave links to my social media in the description as well, so you can find me all over the internet. And until I see you next time, bye.